We want to learn a few lessons from a very familiar passage. The passage is Isaiah chapter 6. Most of you know this is the passage where God calls Isaiah into his service. What I'd like to do at the very outset is to give you an outline for Isaiah chapter 6. As you look at the first 4 verses of Isaiah chapter 6, you see Isaiah taking an upward look, because the Bible says he saw the Lord, he was high and lifted up. From verses 5 to 7, Isaiah takes the inward look. He now says, "Woe am I am a man of unclean lips." He sees himself. And thirdly, he then takes an outward look. He's able to now see the needs of people around him. He takes the upward look, he sees God. He takes the inward look, he sees himself. And then he takes the outward look, he sees the needs of people around him. In this meditation, we want to look at the first 4 verses. Isaiah taking that upward look. Where does it begin? It begins in verse 1, chapter 6. The Bible says, in the year when Uzziah died. So I'd like to suggest that Isaiah chapter 6 begins with a moment of grief in the life of the prophet Isaiah. Who was Uzziah? He had reigned over the household of Judah for 52 years. Was he a good king? He was a man that had brought prosperity. He was a man that had brought peace. He was a man that had brought progress to the people of Judah. So in many ways, the people of Judah had much hope in this man called Uzziah. And the time when Uzziah died was a time of great disturbance in the household of Judah. This was a time when people were shaken up. This was a time when people were uncertain of their future. And in some ways, even for the prophet Isaiah, this was a time when he was not too sure what was going to happen, because Isaiah was also one that in some ways looked up to Uzziah, because this was a man that seemingly had been blessed by God. Even though towards the end of his life, he became a leper because of his pride and arrogance against God, yet this was a man that had left an indelible mark as being a good leader over the household of Judah. And so as you begin Isaiah chapter 6, you begin with a moment of grief. Somebody that I trusted in has been taken away. All of a sudden everything is shaking. And at that point when everything is shaking, what does God do? In a time of grief, God shows his glory to Isaiah. I'd like us to look at these verses and learn a few lessons about the glory of God. The Bible says, I saw the Lord high and exalted. The first lesson that Isaiah would learn is that on that day, as he looked up, he saw the position of his God. His God is King of kings and Lord of lords. He is high and lifted up. There is none like him. The second thing that he saw is that not only did he see the position of his God, he says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and he was seated on the throne. In verse 1, the throne of the earth is empty. Uzziah has died. Now God shows him his heavenly throne, and God is saying to Isaiah, not only is my position one that is high and lifted up, I am permanently on the throne. This is about the permanence of God. Thrones of the earth come and go, but the throne in eternity, God is enthroned upon that throne forever and ever. So Isaiah sees the high and exalted position of God. He sees the permanence of God. God is seated on the throne. And then the Bible says, the train of his robe filled the temple. Verse 4, smoke filled the temple. Isaiah is now overwhelmed by the presence of God. What I'd like you to keep in mind is that it filled the temple. There was no space for anybody else. This was all about God and God alone. Isaiah sees the position of God. Isaiah sees the permanence of God. Isaiah is now in awe of the presence of God. And then the Bible says, as Isaiah is processing all of this, above him were seraphim with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. With 2 wings they covered their feet. With 2 wings they were flying, and they were singing to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Isaiah now sees the perfection of God. This is perfect God. He is holy, holy, holy. There is none like him. And then the next lesson that Isaiah learns, very important one that we sometimes miss, is that Isaiah learns to look at life in the perspective of heaven. The Bible says, this is a song the angels were singing, the whole earth is filled with his glory. For Isaiah, the earth was filled with not the glory of God. The earth was filled with confusion. But as heaven looked down, the earth was filled with his glory. God is on the throne. This earth will be filled with his glory. And in some ways, we've got to look at life from that perspective, because sometimes we look at our life and we think everything is a mess. But I want to tell you, as heaven looks down, this earth will be filled with his glory. And then finally the Bible says, and the threshold shook. Isaiah was now in view of the power of God. This is a powerful God. His position, he is high and lifted up. His permanence. He is on the throne forever and ever. His presence, His robe fills the temple. His smoke fills the temple. Number 4, His perfection. He is holy, holy, holy. Number 5, the perspective of heaven. The whole earth will be filled with His glory. And finally, His power. The whole temple shakes at the glory of God. In my hand I have 2 coins, just ordinary coins. And I'm going to ask you to do something very ridiculous. I'm going to ask you to compare these coins to the sun. Some of you are already laughing because there's no compare, right? But here's what I'd like you to do. Take these coins and put them upon your eyes. You know what they do? They cut off the glory of the sun. Sometimes those Uzziahs, sometimes our confidence in our money, in our degrees, in our families, our worries, sometimes cloud out the glory of God. I pray that today you'll be able to take away, we'll be able to allow God's Spirit to take away anything that comes in way. And you'll be able to see the glory of God. I pray that God would bless you through this meditation.